Hey, what is up guys? This is Nishi from MST.TV here, back with another Market Watch episode. So today we have a lot of different things to talk about. Now this past weekend was a really big one, since we had not one, but two YCSs, one in Lille and one in Peru. And of course, we have YCS Anaheim this upcoming weekend as well, so we're getting our first big taste of this upcoming format over just a couple of weekends. At the same time, we are of course going to keep an eye on cards that are trending because of Genesys format, as that seems to be what has captured a lot of the player base's attention, and it's causing a lot of movement with cards that we haven't seen too much of in quite a while. Let's get started. Alright, now kicking things off, we're taking a look at several of the Odon cards from Maze of the Master. Now I'm going to group a few different cards here together because a lot of what I have to say about one is going to apply to the others as well, so hopefully that eliminates some of the redundancies. Now the Odon deck is one that hasn't been particularly popular since its release. It got a bit of hype initially, and it's able to make use of cool cards like Silo Hat Rabbit and the Statue of Anguish pattern, but with cards like Lightning Storm and Feather Duster being fairly popular in the format, the deck never really had a chance to be all that successful. However, Odon has a couple of really big things that are pushing players to pick up the cards. Now the first is that the Odon Primite deck is actually what won YCS Lille with the deck list that you guys can see here. It's definitely an interesting deck, and maybe there was a bit of a luck factor and the player won a lot of their dice rolls, but still, winning like 15 or 16 rounds at a huge event just can't all just be a fluke, right? So huge props here. Now the other thing is that the Odon deck is actually getting some attention as a Genesys format deck. A lot of the cards aren't hit, and then some of those blowout cards are going to cost you a lot of points, so the deck is actually much better positioned in Genesys format than it is in Modern. Now as a result, we are seeing a lot of buyouts for several of the different Odon cards. The most significant was with Apophis the Serpent. This is the new trap monster that just came out in Maze of the Master itself earlier this year. As you guys can see on the graph, this was only a $5 or so card, but with all of the attention that the card's gotten recently, it has shot up the past week or so and now sits between $18 and $20 per copy. Now there are a couple of other notable cards here that are worth mentioning for the same reason. We have the Man with the Mark, which was a secret rare from Maze of the Master. Now this was down at $2 each, now they're up to about $5 to $6 per copy. And then very similar story here with the Field Spell Treasure of the Kings, which was a $1 or $2 card, but is now up to $5 each. Now overall, with the Odon cards, I do have to say that they do feel due to be reprinted, right? I feel like we're approaching the time where 7th Tachyon should be reprinted because it is so impactful to the meta, and the Apophis cards were in the same set, so we could see all of them clumped together into a reprint set. At the same time, I don't think that the deck is going to be that prominent in terms of the format. In Genesys format, this is a very strong deck. They did take 2 spots at Farfa's tournament, but the format is so wide and the points can change so quickly that it's hard to say. And then in Modern, I think it's something that players will just be better prepared for. I don't think the deck is really going to be able to consistently compete with strategies like Yami, Dracotail, and Mitsurugi across the entire upcoming format. That said, this is a card that you probably want to keep 3 copies of if you want to try out the Odon deck in either Modern or Genesys format, because it's a really great, fun choice, especially if you like control decks. Other than that though, you definitely want to sell these off while they are seeing a crazy amount of hype. On to the next card here, we next have Dark Spirit's Mastery. So this is a bit of an odd card. It's actually supposed to be support for Bakura's Destiny board deck, so it does have a graveyard effect, but for the most part that isn't going to be too relevant. However, its main effect is that on activation, you can discard a card to search for a level 8 Fiend monster from your deck or graveyard. Now obviously at first glance this does seem pretty bad because you're going -1 to search for a high level Fiend, so your search target better be pretty good. Well, it turns out that there's 2 reasons for this card's huge surge in demand. First of all, Triff actually played this card as a 1-of in his sideboard alongside 2 copies of Lava Golem, as you guys can see here. Lava Golem happens to be a level 8 Fiend, so you can search for Lava Golem to help break through your opponent's boards. Now for me personally, I don't really know how great of an option this is. I understand wanting to be able to thrust into Mastery, so that thrust is basically searching for a board breaker that your opponent can't respond to, and obviously I can't argue with the results that Triff had. But I'm sure that the surprise factor definitely played a role in this card's success being here. The other thing I'm seeing with Dark Spirit's Mastery is people talking about using it in the DDD deck, which got support in Doom of Dimensions. Of course, this card lets you search for 0 Doom Queen Machinex which is one of the most important and broken new cards that basically helps the DDD strategy to be somewhat relevant once again. This one though, I'm not entirely convinced by. I haven't looked too much into DDDs, like a crazy amount or anything, but from all the lists that I have seen, I don't see any of them running Dark Spirit's Mastery. It doesn't seem to be something that's very common in very many builds. Like, it's a card that you can use, but I don't see why you would want to run a neg one in that deck anyways, especially when there are a lot of other, just better cards that you can be running. But that said, this card does have a few different printings. It's actually just the original holo printing that has jumped in price, as ultras from Legendary Duelist Immortal Destiny have gone from being $3 or $4 before to now being up at anywhere between the $15 to $20 range. It does, however, have two different common printings, both of which were pretty easy to pull, and both of which are literally like 25 cents each. That said, I do think it's possible that the card could get a reprint, right? It definitely could get an OTS super rare reprint. Honestly, with the commons available, I don't think that that's that much of a reason to freak out about this card. At the same time, I'm definitely thinking this one isn't going to be all that meta relevant moving forward. Like, yes, Triff did use the card and win with it, but that doesn't mean this is going to be the gold standard for side deck cards by any means moving forward. That said, this is a card that I'm definitely trying to sell off if you happen to own some of the ultras, since I'm not really expecting all that much play out of the card moving forward. If you do really want to try the card out in your sideboard, grab a set of the commons for like $1 and you should be good to go. So here's an interesting one. The next card we have is Ultimate Slayer. This is actually a pretty crazy board breaker. It lets you target an opponent's monster, then send a monster from your extra deck of that type to the graveyard and bounce the opponent's card, and your opponent can't activate monster effects in response to this card's activation. Now, over the years, Ultimate Slayer has been in and out of players' sideboards. This was a really popular card early on in the OCG when it came out, but it never saw that much play early on in the TCG. Eventually, it did see a decent amount of play, but then it fell out of favor once again. However, this card did actually end up seeing a reprint in Rarity Collection 2, and it was one of the more sought after cards in the set. Now, the card actually is seeing a lot of hype with Genesys format. The card costs 0 points, as do a lot of its dump targets. Without links, you can choose to run one Xyz, Synchro, and Fusion as dump targets to cover any extra deck type that your opponent is including in their strategy. Now, obviously, you don't have to include a link, but given that with Genesys format, you can't just throw links into your extra deck, right? So Ultimate Slayer is a very powerful board breaker, alongside cards like Myriologic Aggregator for Xyz, Garura for Fusions, or Malong or Wind Pegasus Adagnaster for Synchros, and they become a really solid package that you can choose to run in the side deck and extra deck, given that you have the space. As I mentioned before, Ultimate Slayer did get a reprint in Rarity Collection 2, so most of its printings are going to be quite affordable. However, over the last week or two since the release of Genesys format, we are starting to see a lot of movement with a lot of the lower rarity versions of Ultimate Slayer, as players want to make sure that they have their copies available. That said, it's not crazy price movement. This is a card that was only $1 or so for the lower rarity super and ultra rare printings, and slightly more but still pretty cheap for some of those lower end luxury rarities, but we are gradually starting to see all copies of the card moving up to around $2 to $3 a piece. Not an insane amount of money again, but enough that this is something you should probably set aside out of your bulk. Now, moving forward, given that Ultimate Slayer was in Rarity Collection 2 and has all of those rarities available, I don't think this is something that needs to be reprinted or will be reprinted anytime soon. However, I do think that this card is going to be an extremely relevant one in a lot of Genesys format decks, especially once players start to establish what exactly the meta is. Also, Genesys format is something that is drawing a lot of older players back into the game, so a lot of them probably weren't playing when Rarity Collection 2 came out. They won't have opened the set, and so they won't have their copies of Ultimate Slayer lying around, so we can expect there to be a lot of demand for this card from returning players to the game. That said, I think that this is going to continue to be a useful card in the format and is something you should definitely hold on to, assuming that Konami doesn't randomly decide to make this card or its dump targets worth points. I could definitely see super and ultra rare copies of Ultimate Slayers reaching around $5 per copy within a couple of months. Up next is another Genesys format card. Let's talk about Iron Thunder. So I feel like this is a pretty straightforward one that really shouldn't require all that much explanation. This is a counter trap that lets you negate a spell, trap, or monster effect, and then destroy all cards in the same column as the card you are negating. So early on here in Genesys format, Iron Thunder has basically emerged as a side deck staple. Unlike Solemn Judgment, this card can't stop summons, but it does stop monster effects instead, so it may be better or worse depending on the matchup. However, the big thing is obviously that Iron Thunder doesn't cost any points, so it's something that decks are able to throw in pretty freely when they are going first. Now early on it seems that cards like this, Cosmic Cyclone, and DD Crow are 0-point staples that a lot of players are adding into their sideboard. However, Iron Thunder is a bit different in that it has much more limited availability. This was originally a secret rare in Phantom Nightmare and just got its first reprint in the 2025 tins. Now at the same time, we do want to remember that Iron Thunder is still a pretty viable card in modern Yu-Gi-Oh formats as well, with Solemn Judgment now limited to 1. Maybe this is a counter trap that players will consider sideboarding, though obviously it has competition with cards like Solemn Strike and Solemn Warning. Now price-wise, this was originally looking like it was going to be extremely cheap when the tins came out, right? When the tins dropped, Iron Thunders were only about $3 a piece, and the originals had fallen in price as well. However, the card is seeing much more usage than I think was originally expected, and also the pool of secret rares in the tins was huge, and you were only getting 3 secret rares per tin, so it's definitely a harder to find card than I think a lot of players were expecting. Because of this, we are seeing both of the cards printing starting to trend upwards, with the originals coming in at about $10 and the reprints jumping up to around $8 a piece. Now, moving forward, I don't think that Iron Thunder sees a reprint anytime soon. It just got reprinted, so it kind of depends on how much Konami was anticipating this card's demand with Genesys format, since they can't just throw the card into the next product randomly, right? It does take a while before they start to slot in-demand cards into upcoming sets, so if it's just getting onto their radar now, we might not see that reprint come for another 6 to 12 months. However, I definitely see Iron Thunder being one of the more in-demand cards of Genesys format in general, of course, assuming that it doesn't suddenly cost any number of points. Now this is a risk. We don't know how Konami is going to be redistributing points with cards like this when they seem to just become staples in Genesys format, but with what we know for now, Iron Thunder looks to be a really solid card to hold on to, and it should only get more and more popular as a side deck option as players get more experience with the Genesys format itself. Alright, so one other card here related to Genesys format, it's Exosister Martha. Now, Martha is the card that was introduced to the Exosister theme a bit late. However, it single-handedly made them a much more consistent strategy, helping to pull Ellis out of the deck so that you could make an Xyz play, but locking you into only Exosister special summons. So early on, Exosisters were actually one of the most hyped decks that players have been talking about going into Genesys format. The deck, even if you played it in modern format, doesn't really play link monsters. They have some cool interactions, they're supported well by the spirit cards, they don't cost any points, and of course they are a waifu strategy. That said, players have been jumping on the deck and grabbing the cards recently. Prior to Genesys format's announcement, Martha was actually pretty cheap, coming in at only a few dollars per copy. Now, however, we actually have both the original secret rares from Power of the Elements, as well as the reprint secret rares from the tins, coming in at anywhere from $5 to $7 per copy. Now with this one, there's not really too much to say, especially since Genesys format is still so young. We're all still figuring out the format, so it's not yet clear if it's really going to be that good of a deck, or if they're just going to keep on dying to kaijus the way that they kind of did before when they were trying to be relevant. That said, I definitely could see Konami reprinting the entire Exosister theme, or trying to give them some support in the near future, maybe even giving them some alternate arts, just because they are a waifu deck and they're going to be pretty popular with a lot of the player base, and it would be a really cool way to promote Genesys or push it even further. That said, there's a lot of uncertainty around it. It's probably correct to just hold on to one set of all the Exosister cards so that you have the deck available if you do decide to play it, but definitely look to move your extra copies at your locals along with the rest of the core to get max value out of them. Alright guys, that is all I have for today's episode. Thanks for all of your feedback regarding the new layout. So as you guys obviously see, I switched myself over to the left side of the screen here, but other than that, I think everything else looks okay, so we're gonna roll with this moving forward. Anyways guys, if you did enjoy today's Market Watch episode, please make sure you let me know by hitting that thumbs up button. Make sure you leave a comment in the comment section down below. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and of course, guys, don't forget to hold on to your MST.TV.